Welcome back to our channel, Shattered Trust Stories, where we explore the untold stories of relationships, heartbreaks, and the unexpected twists of life. Let's get started. There's a feeling we all crave when we're in a relationship. A kind of peaceful certainty, where everything feels right, where trust is the foundation and love is the constant. You wake up each day knowing that you're not alone, that someone out there has your back. But what happens when that trust starts to shatter? When the very person you thought would never hurt you becomes the one to break you. Let me take you into Sarah's world. Sarah, like many of us, thought she had it all. A loving boyfriend, a future to look forward to, and a relationship that felt like it could withstand anything. Mark, her boyfriend of 3 years, was her best friend, her confidant. They shared laughs, late-night talks, weekend adventures, and even their little secrets. They were a team. At first, it was little things, tiny shifts in behavior that Sarah couldn't quite explain. The way Mark was no longer as attentive to her messages, or the way he would always seem to have plans when she suggested spending time together. But Sarah didn't want to jump to conclusions. She told herself, maybe he's just busy with work, maybe he's stressed, maybe it's nothing. Then the changes got harder to ignore. One night, Sarah had planned a surprise dinner for Mark. She was excited. She'd spent the whole day preparing his favorite meal, setting the table just right. She wanted to show him how much she cared. But when Mark came home, he was distant. He barely looked at her, barely smiled. His mind was elsewhere. She noticed that when he did glance at his phone, he quickly turned it face down. An odd thing to do when you're in a loving relationship, isn't it? As Sarah sat across from him at the dinner table, a knot tightened in her stomach. The laughter that once filled their space was replaced with silence. The warmth between them felt like it had faded into something cold, something unrecognizable. She tried to brush it off. She told herself that they were just going through a phase. Relationships have ups and downs, right? But the doubt continued to gnaw at her. Every time Mark's phone buzzed, her eyes couldn't help but flicker toward it. It wasn't just the strange behavior, it was the feeling, that gut feeling that something was wrong. One evening, Mark was supposed to meet her after work. She had just come back from a long day herself and wanted to unwind with him, to laugh, to reconnect. She was waiting for him, eager to see him. But then, out of nowhere, he called to cancel. He'd forgotten about plans with his friends. Sarah's heart sank as she heard the hollow sound of his voice. It wasn't the apology she had expected, and it wasn't the warmth that had always been there before. As she sat alone that night, a thought kept circling in her mind. What if he's seeing someone else? The more she thought about it, the more the idea took root. But there was no way to know for sure. No concrete evidence. Just a gut feeling. A feeling so strong it almost suffocated her. But still, she pushed it down. Because how could she accuse him without proof? How could she question the love they'd built without destroying everything? But the truth was, Sarah wasn't blind. She wasn't naive. She knew that people change, and relationships change, too. And as much as she hated to admit it, there was a growing part of her that feared what was coming next. Mark had been slipping away, and she could feel it. The person she loved, the man who once called her the love of his life, was becoming a stranger. And she was left trying to hold on to something that was slipping through her fingers. It was in the quiet moments, the ones where Sarah found herself staring at their photos together, that it hit her. This wasn't just about a few bad days or a few missed dates. This was something deeper. Something far more painful. Was Mark still the man she fell in love with? Or had she been holding on to an illusion of a love that no longer existed? And so, one night, while Mark was in the shower, Sarah did something she never thought she would do. She picked up his phone. Her heart raced as she unlocked it. She wasn't proud of it, but she had to know. Was this the moment everything changed? Was she about to face the truth, no matter how painful? The screen lit up. And there it was. A message. from a number she didn't recognize. It read, "I can't wait to see you tonight." Same place? Everything stopped, the room felt smaller. Her breath caught in her throat. Her hands shook as the weight of the message settled in. The trust she had built with Mark, her partner, her love, her best friend, was crumbling in front of her. The gut feeling she had dismissed for so long, the doubt that she had tried to ignore, was real. He had been lying to her. And now, her heart felt like it was breaking in two. The room felt suffocating. Sarah's fingers trembled as she stared at the phone, the message from an unknown number lingering on the screen like an unspoken truth. Everything that had felt secure, everything she believed was real, now seemed like a lie. The world around her faded, and in that quiet moment, her heart shattered into pieces she couldn't possibly put back together. Mark's voice called out from the bathroom. "Hey, I'll be out in a second." But Sarah couldn't move. She couldn't even breathe. She wasn't prepared for this. She wasn't prepared to feel the ground beneath her feet crumble. The phone slipped from her hands onto the bed, and she stood there, paralyzed, as the realization hit her. This wasn't a bad dream. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Mark, the man she had trusted with her heart, had been hiding something from her. Someone else was in his life. She felt sick to her stomach. The weight of that single sentence in the message, the simple, cruel words, "same place," was like a knife twisted in her chest. It was everything she had feared, all the suspicions that had been gnawing at the back of her mind, now staring her in the face. But how could she confront him? What would she say? Could she even trust her own eyes? Was she overreacting? Maybe there was an explanation, maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe Mark could explain it away, just like he always did, but deep down, she knew. It wasn't a misunderstanding. He had been lying to her. He had been seeing someone else. And that was the most painful part of all. Sarah couldn't bring herself to pick up the phone again. It felt like it would burn her fingers, like it was too much to bear. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands covering her face, her heart heavy with a weight that threatened to suffocate her. Her thoughts swirled in a haze of confusion and disbelief. How could he do this? How could he betray me like this? The tears came slowly at first, then faster. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want to admit that everything she thought she knew about love and loyalty was slipping away. But it was impossible to hold it in. Her chest ached, and with every sob, the pain of betrayal spread deeper. Mark emerged from the bathroom, oblivious to the storm that had just hit. He seemed like his usual self, casual, carefree. But Sarah could barely look at him without seeing the lies in his eyes, without hearing the cruel, silent words his phone had spoken. "Hey," he said, glancing around. "What's wrong? You look different." Different. How could he not know? How could he not see the look on her face, the way she was falling apart right before him? "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Whose same place?" Her voice barely made it out. It was like a whisper carried on a prayer, hoping that maybe she was wrong, that maybe this was all just a horrible dream. Mark froze. The brief flicker of guilt that passed through his eyes was barely noticeable, but it was there. Sarah saw it. It was enough to confirm her worst fear. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't even sorry. "Sarah, it's not what you think," Mark began, but his voice trailed off. He knew there was no excuse, no way to cover up the truth. Sarah could feel her heart beating in her throat. "Not what you think?" She had seen the message. The proof was right there, sitting between them. What could he possibly say to make this okay? He stepped closer to her, his face softening, but Sarah recoiled, almost instinctively. The warmth she had once felt when he touched her was gone. The man she loved no longer seemed like the same person. She didn't know who he was anymore. "Who is she, Mark?" Sarah asked, her voice cutting through the silence like a razor. Mark's eyes faltered for a moment, then he looked away. He didn't answer her immediately. Instead, he sighed deeply, as if he were already exhausted from the weight of his lies. Sarah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen, but I've been seeing someone else. For the past few months. Her world spun. Everything she thought she knew, everything she had built with him, now felt like it was crumbling. Her head was spinning, her thoughts racing. He's been seeing someone else. The words echoed in her mind over and over again. Why? She choked out, trying to understand. Why would you do this to me? After everything? Mark ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with his own guilt. I don't know. I got caught up. I made a mistake. I never meant to hurt you. He was fumbling for words, but none of them seemed real. None of them seemed to matter anymore. Did you love her? Sarah asked, her voice breaking. She needed to know. She needed to know if she had been just another option to him, or if he had truly cared for her in the same way he once claimed to. Mark paused, and for the first time since he'd walked into the room, Sarah saw a glimpse of regret in his eyes. But it didn't matter now. The damage was done. I don't know, he admitted softly, his voice barely a whisper. He doesn't know. That was the worst part. He didn't know if he had loved her. He didn't know if what they had was real. It was as if everything they had shared had been meaningless to him. Sarah stood up abruptly, feeling the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. She didn't want to hear any more excuses. She didn't need to hear him try to explain his way out of this. He had broken her trust. He had betrayed her in the most painful way possible. Just go, she said, her voice steady now. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a demand. It was a quiet, firm statement. She was done. The trust had been shattered beyond repair. Mark looked at her, his eyes pleading for some kind of forgiveness, some kind of understanding. But Sarah had nothing left to give him. I don't want to be with you anymore, Mark, she said, her voice unwavering. I can't. And just like that, the man she had loved for so long, the man she thought she knew, was a stranger. He had torn her apart, and nothing he said could undo the pain. Sarah's words hung in the air between them, heavier than any silence she had ever endured. I can't, she had said. I don't want to be with you anymore, Mark. And yet, the weight of those words, the finality of them, was almost impossible to bear. Her heart ached, and though she had just broken something, it felt like it was her heart that was being shattered, piece by piece. Mark didn't move. He stood there, staring at her, his eyes wide, as though he was waiting for her to take it all back, for her to change her mind. But Sarah knew that there was no going back. The trust, the foundation of everything they had built together, had been obliterated. She had seen the message, heard the confession, and felt the hollow echo of everything falling apart. For a long moment, Mark said nothing. Then, as though trying to muster something, anything, he stepped forward. Please, Sarah, his voice cracked. I'm sorry. I don't know what else to say. I never wanted to hurt you. But Sarah couldn't listen anymore. She had heard enough. His apologies, his regret, the shallow explanations, it didn't matter. They were just words. Words that couldn't undo the betrayal. Words that couldn't heal the deep wound he had inflicted upon her. I don't want to hear it, Mark, she said firmly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. You don't get to come back from this. Not after what you did. Her heart felt like it was breaking in two, but there was something else, something strong, something resilient rising up inside of her. She realized, in that instant, that she didn't need his apology to validate her feelings. She didn't need him to fix anything. He had broken it, and now, she was the one who had to pick up the pieces. Mark's face twisted with a mix of disbelief and pain. "I don't know what to do without you, Sarah," he said, his voice pleading. "Please, just give me a chance to explain. I never meant for this to happen." But there was no explanation. There was nothing that could justify what he had done. Sarah had loved him with everything she had. She had trusted him with her heart, her life. And he had thrown it all away. It wasn't just about the affair, it was about everything he had hidden from her. The lies, the secrecy, the emotional distance. It was all a betrayal of her. Of the person she was when she was with him. And that was something she couldn't undo. "I'm done, Mark," Sarah said, her voice trembling, but resolute. "I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when it's not. I won't stay with someone who doesn't value me. I won't stay with someone who could hurt me like this." She turned away from him, unable to face the man who had once been her world. The room felt suffocating, as though it was closing in on her. She needed space, she needed air, she needed to escape this moment that had already begun to define her pain. Mark stood there for a moment longer, his gaze following her as she walked away. His hands were at his sides, and his lips trembled, as though he wanted to reach out, to stop her from leaving. But Sarah couldn't afford to stay any longer. She couldn't afford to keep dragging herself through the pain he had caused. She stepped into the other room, shutting the door softly behind her, and allowed herself to collapse onto the bed. Her body trembled with the force of the emotions crashing through her. A million thoughts raced through her mind, all of them sharp and jagged. Why? How could he? Didn't he care about me? And the question that plagued her the most, what happens now? She had never felt more alone. Her mind was a swirl of confusion, hurt, and disbelief. She had been so sure of their love. She had been so certain that she knew who Mark was, that he would never betray her. But now, the trust she had held so tightly was gone, like sand slipping through her fingers. The tears came again. This time, they weren't just for what Mark had done to her. They were for the woman she had been before. The woman who believed in love, who believed in happy endings, who thought that loyalty was a given. That woman was gone now, and Sarah didn't know who she was anymore. For what felt like hours, Sarah lay there, crying silently, her body racked with the weight of her grief. She couldn't understand how her life had gone from a place of security to one of complete and utter destruction. And the worst part was that it was all because of Mark. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted. As the night stretched on, Sarah's emotions began to shift. The initial shock had worn off, and what remained was a deep sense of emptiness. She felt hollow, as though the space Mark had occupied in her life was now vacant, and there was no way to fill it. The love she had once felt for him seemed distant now, like a fading memory. She glanced over at the phone on the bed, the phone that had set everything in motion. The message still lay there, mocking her with its cold, heartless words. Her finger hovered over the screen, and for a brief moment, she considered calling him, hearing him out. But she knew better. She knew that what she was really looking for wasn't closure, it was the hope that he could somehow undo the damage he had done. But Sarah was no fool. She knew that the truth had already been revealed. There was nothing he could say that would change it. She reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts, her finger pausing over the name of her best friend, Emily. Emily had been there for her through everything, and she needed her now more than ever. With a trembling hand, Sarah tapped the screen to call her. Emily answered on the first ring. "Sarah? Hey, what's wrong?" Sarah couldn't speak at first. The words wouldn't come. The emotions flooded back, and she could barely catch her breath. "Emily, he's been seeing someone else," Sarah whispered through her sobs. "He's been cheating on me. I don't know what to do." The words came out in a rush, a tidal wave of pain that Sarah had been holding in for far too long. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," Emily said softly. I'm here. We'll get through this. I promise. For the first time since the confrontation, Sarah allowed herself to lean into someone. She needed to hear those words. She needed to know she wasn't alone. And in that moment, she realized that though Mark had broken her trust, she didn't have to go through this pain alone. She had people who loved her. She had herself. And slowly, though the road ahead would be long, she would rebuild. She would heal. The days that followed Mark's departure were a blur for Sarah. Each one felt the same, heavy, slow, and suffocating. She had asked him to leave, and he had. The space between them now was more than just physical, it was emotional, deep, and raw. At first, she had tried to stay busy, to distract herself from the gaping wound in her chest. She threw herself into her work, telling herself that staying occupied was the best way to heal. But no matter how much she worked, no matter how many tasks she completed, the silence at home was louder than anything she could do to fill it at night. When the world outside was still and quiet, Sarah would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, her thoughts swirling. She couldn't stop thinking about Mark, about what they had, what she thought they had. She thought about the moments they had shared, the promises he had made, and the dreams they had built together. All of it felt like a lie now. Every word he had ever spoken to her, every gesture of love, seemed tainted by the reality of his betrayal. The isolation became her companion. Sarah's friends tried reaching out to her, but she wasn't ready. She couldn't face them. She couldn't explain the pain she was in, not yet. The truth felt too raw, too fresh, too fragile to share. She didn't want to tell them that her life had been ripped apart by someone she had trusted more than anyone. It was easier to be alone, to sit with the weight of her grief without having to explain it to anyone. She avoided social media, knowing that seeing pictures of other happy couples would only make the sting of her own heartbreak worse. When she did see Mark's friends in passing, they offered empty words of sympathy, but Sarah didn't want their pity. She didn't want their awkward attempts at comforting her. She didn't need them to remind her that her relationship had ended in such a humiliating, painful way. The worst part, though, was the emptiness that settled inside her. It was as if a part of her had gone missing, something she couldn't find, something she couldn't quite understand. She had been so sure that Mark was her person. She had been so certain that they were meant to be. But now, every time she looked in the mirror, she saw someone she didn't recognize. The person who had believed in love, in commitment, in trust, was gone. In her place was a woman who had been betrayed, a woman who wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Each day, Sarah found herself asking the same question: how did this happen? How did she go from being loved, to being completely discarded? Was she not enough? Was there something wrong with her that made Mark seek love elsewhere? What did she miss? She combed through every conversation they had ever had, every argument, every quiet moment, wondering where the cracks had first appeared. She realized that for all the time they spent together, there were things she had never known. He had hidden parts of himself from her, parts that had led him to betray her. But why? What had driven him to make that choice? And then, the more she thought about it, the more she realized something else. She had been so focused on trying to make it work, on holding everything together, that she had neglected herself. She had lost herself in the relationship. She had put Mark's needs before her own, thinking that if she did everything right, he would love her the way she deserved. But now, in the aftermath of the betrayal, Sarah was forced to confront the painful truth. She had given so much of herself that she had forgotten who she was outside of him. She thought about the woman she used to be before Mark. The confident, independent person who had dreams of her own. She realized she had stopped dreaming for herself. Instead, she had let Mark's dreams become hers, his happiness her goal. She had sacrificed parts of herself for the sake of their relationship, hoping that love would be enough to make up for the sacrifices. But love, real love, wasn't about sacrifice like that. It was about partnership, respect, and trust. And trust had been broken. Sarah realized she had been living in a constant state of uncertainty, always second-guessing herself and her worth. She had allowed herself to become so intertwined with Mark's identity that she had lost sight of who she truly was. Now, she had to find herself again. She had to rebuild, not just her trust in others, but in herself. She started taking small steps. It wasn't easy. At first, it felt awkward. But slowly, Sarah began to do things that made her feel alive again. She went for walks in the park, letting the fresh air clear her mind. She called old friends, the ones she had neglected during the relationship. She started reading again, books that had nothing to do with her life or her past with Mark. One evening, after days of trying to avoid the mess of her emotions, Sarah found herself sitting in front of a mirror, her reflection staring back at her. For the first time in a long time, she took a deep breath and truly saw herself. She wasn't just the broken woman who had been betrayed. She was more than that. She was someone who had endured heartbreak, who had felt the sting of betrayal and had survived it. And in that moment, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. She would rebuild. It would take time, and it would be painful, but she would heal. She would be whole again, but the healing didn't come in a straight line. There were good days, and there were bad days. Some days, she felt like she could take on the world. Other days, she woke up with a heaviness in her chest, unsure of how she could keep going. The pain of betrayal was something that crept up on her, catching her when she least expected it. There were nights when she would lie awake, remembering the good times with Mark, and wonder if he was thinking about her too. And then, there were nights when she couldn't even bring herself to look at his pictures, afraid it would make her break all over again. She knew the journey would be long. But she also knew that she couldn't remain trapped in the past. The betrayal, as painful as it was, couldn't define her forever. Sarah had to choose to move forward, not because she owed it to Mark, but because she owed it to herself, and with that choice, she started to feel the flicker of hope again. It was small, almost imperceptible at first, but it was there. She could feel it. The possibility of a future that didn't include Mark. The possibility of a future that was hers, and hers alone. Weeks had passed since that night, the night Sarah had ended everything with Mark. The rawness of the pain had slowly begun to fade, but in its place, a different kind of ache lingered, a quieter, deeper ache. It wasn't the sharp pain of betrayal anymore, but the slow realization that she was no longer the person she had once been. She was someone new, someone who had been through something devastating and had survived it. She wasn't who she was before Mark. But maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing. Sarah had spent the last few weeks in a fog of emotion, sometimes angry, sometimes sad, sometimes numb. There were days when she woke up and felt like she could take on the world, and others where even getting out of bed seemed like an impossible task. The emotional roller coaster had become almost predictable. She had good days and bad days, but slowly, the good ones were starting to outnumber the bad. It was on one of those good days that Sarah realized something. She had been letting the past control her for too long. She had been holding on to the anger, to the hurt, to the betrayal, but none of it was changing the fact that her relationship with Mark was over. None of it could take away the pain, but none of it was going to bring him back either. She stood in front of her mirror one evening, looking at herself with new eyes. For the first time, she wasn't just seeing the woman who had been betrayed, the woman who had been heartbroken. She was seeing a woman who was stronger than she had realized. A woman who had survived the hardest thing she had ever gone through and was still standing. The tears that had once come in waves now came in trickles, like the last remnants of a storm that was finally passing. The storm inside her had calmed, and though the scars of the past would always remain, Sarah realized they didn't define her. What defined her now was how she chose to move forward. How she chose to use the pain to grow, to change, and to become the person she was always meant to be. She thought back to the woman she had been in the early days of her relationship with Mark. That woman had been full of dreams, full of possibilities. She had been confident, hopeful, and fearless. And somehow, over the years, those qualities had faded into the background. She had been so focused on making Mark happy, on building a life together, that she had lost touch with who she was at her core. But now, as she looked at herself in the mirror, Sarah made a vow. She would never lose herself again. The first step was accepting that the relationship with Mark was over. It wasn't easy. There were nights when she still felt the emptiness, the longing for what could have been. There were days when the memories of their time together made her heart ache. But as she reflected more, she came to understand that the relationship hadn't been perfect. It hadn't been healthy. It had been built on lies, on secrets, on broken trust. And as much as she had once loved Mark, as much as she had tried to make it work, she knew deep down that she deserved better. She deserved honesty, respect, and loyalty. She deserved a love that was built on trust, not one that was shattered by betrayal. Sarah realized that accepting the end of her relationship with Mark wasn't just about letting go of him, it was about letting go of the life she had envisioned with him. She had to let go of the future they had planned, the house they were going to buy, the family they had talked about. Those dreams had belonged to the version of herself who had been with Mark, and it was time for Sarah to make new dreams. She had to let go of the old story so she could begin writing a new one. At first, it felt like a loss. There was grief, there was pain, there was a sense of mourning for the future she had imagined. But over time, Sarah began to understand that letting go wasn't the same as giving up. Letting go wasn't a failure, it was an act of strength. She was freeing herself from the past so she could create a future that was truly hers, one that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or validation. The days turned into weeks, and Sarah started to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It was small at first, like a flicker in the dark, but it was there. She had spent so much time thinking about what she had lost, about the relationship that had ended, but now, she started to think about what she had gained. She had gained her independence back. She had gained her sense of self. She had gained the strength to leave behind something that wasn't right for her. Even though it was painful to do so, she realized that she was no longer just Sarah who had been in a relationship with Mark. She was Sarah who was building a future for herself. She was Sarah who was learning to trust herself again. She was Sarah who had endured heartbreak and come out on the other side stronger than she had ever been. There were moments when the past crept in, when the memories of Mark's smile, the sound of his voice, the warmth of his touch, would flood her mind. And it hurt, no doubt about it. But she was learning to let those memories be just that, memories. She wasn't going to let them control her life anymore. She wasn't going to let them dictate her future. Instead, Sarah started to make plans for herself. She took up new hobbies, things she had always wanted to do but had put aside for the sake of her relationship. She began volunteering at a local animal shelter, something she had always felt passionate about. She reconnected with old friends, people she hadn't seen in years, and began building her social circle again. She found joy in the little things: coffee with a friend, a quiet walk through the park, a book she couldn't put down. She wasn't fully healed yet, but she could feel the transformation happening inside of her. She was no longer the woman who had been betrayed. She was becoming the woman she was always meant to be: strong, independent, and unapologetically herself. And while Sarah knew she would never forget what had happened with Mark, she also knew that her story wasn't over. This was just one chapter. She was turning the page, and the next chapter was hers to write. Months had passed since Sarah had walked away from Mark, and the weight of the betrayal, though still there in the background, had slowly become something she could handle. There were still moments when she found herself thinking about him, moments when the hurt would creep up, threatening to pull her back into the darkness of her grief. But she was learning, slowly but surely, that those moments didn't define her. She was no longer the woman who clung to the past, to the memories of a love that had shattered. She was becoming someone new. One evening, Sarah sat at her desk, staring at a blank screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but her mind was elsewhere. It was a feeling she had become familiar with over the past few months. Her thoughts were constantly moving, replaying moments from her past, questioning decisions she had made, but most of all, thinking about what came next. What was she supposed to do now? The life she had once envisioned was gone, and she had no idea what her future would look like. For the first time, Sarah realized she didn't need to have all the answers. She didn't need to have everything figured out. She didn't have to know what came next, as long as she kept moving forward. The idea of starting fresh was terrifying, but it was also exciting. She could create something entirely new. She could rebuild not just her life, but herself. It was time to rediscover the things that made her feel alive, the things that had once sparked her passion and fueled her dreams. She had spent so much time focusing on Mark, on their relationship, on keeping everything together, that she had forgotten who she was before him. She had forgotten the woman who loved art, the woman who found solace in nature, the woman who had dreams that had nothing to do with a man. That evening, Sarah made a decision. She was going to take time for herself, no distractions, no obligations, just Sarah. The next morning, she woke up early, determined to start this new chapter of her life with intention. She went to the local art museum, a place she used to visit regularly before Mark had come into her life. The familiar scent of old wood, the soft lighting, and the quiet hum of people lost in the beauty of the paintings felt like a breath of fresh air. As Sarah wandered through the galleries, her heart began to open in a way it hadn't in years. She stood in front of a large painting, admiring the bold strokes of color, the emotion captured in the brushwork. For the first time in a long time, she felt a spark inside her. It was a sense of excitement, a realization that there was so much more to life than the pain she had endured. She spent hours in the museum, allowing herself to fully immerse in the beauty around her. It wasn't just about the art, it was about reconnecting with herself. She remembered how, before Mark, she had wanted to become an artist. She had dreamed of one day having her own studio, of painting full-time and living a life that was completely her own. Somewhere along the way, those dreams had gotten lost, buried under the weight of her relationship. But standing there, surrounded by art, Sarah felt something awaken in her. She realized that she could still pursue those dreams. It wasn't too late. The following weeks became a journey of rediscovery. Sarah signed up for an art class at the community center. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She picked up a paintbrush again, feeling the cool surface of the canvas beneath her fingers. The first few strokes were shaky, uncertain, but as she worked, she felt a sense of freedom. There was no pressure, no expectations. It was just her and the paint, creating something from nothing. It was therapeutic, a way to express all the emotions she had been carrying for so long, but it wasn't just about art. Sarah also began exploring other areas of her life that she had neglected. She joined a book club, something she had always wanted to do but had never found the time for. She reconnected with her friends, the ones she had pushed away during her relationship with Mark. She made new friends, too, people who didn't know her past, who saw her for who she was now, not as someone defined by her relationship with Mark. She also took time to focus on her health, something she had ignored for a while. She started running in the mornings, letting the fresh air fill her lungs and clear her mind. It was hard at first, her body aching with every step, but soon she found herself looking forward to the runs. They were a reminder that she was capable, that she could push herself and come out stronger on the other side. But the most significant change came in the way Sarah started to view herself. Slowly, she began to rebuild her confidence, piece by piece. She had spent so much time doubting herself, questioning her worth, and believing that the betrayal was somehow her fault. But now, she was starting to see the truth. She was not broken. She had never been broken. She had just been hurt. And hurt didn't have to define her. There were still moments of doubt, of course. There were days when she woke up feeling unsure, when the weight of her past threatened to pull her back down. But Sarah was learning to let those moments pass. She was learning that she didn't need anyone else to validate her worth. She had everything she needed inside of her. She was enough. The more Sarah embraced this new version of herself, the more she realized that she had everything she needed to create a fulfilling life. She didn't need a relationship to complete her. She didn't need a man to define her. She had herself. And that, in itself, was enough. One evening, after finishing a painting, Sarah stood in front of it, admiring her work. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was hers. It was a reflection of where she had been and where she was going. She could see her growth, her transformation, in the brushstrokes. She was no longer the woman who had been shattered by betrayal. She was someone stronger, someone who had found her voice again. As she stood there, Sarah made another silent promise to herself: I will never stop rebuilding. I will never stop rediscovering who I am. This is only the beginning. It had been a year since Sarah had walked away from Mark, and in that time, she had transformed in ways she hadn't thought possible. The road to healing had been long and challenging, but as she stood at the edge of a new chapter in her life, Sarah realized that every moment of pain, every sleepless night, had led her here, stronger, wiser, and more self-assured than ever before. As the months had passed, Sarah had made peace with her past. The pain of betrayal, once a heavy burden, had started to feel like a distant memory. It was no longer a weight she carried around every day. Instead, it had become part of her story, a story that had shaped her, yes, but did not define her. She had learned to embrace the lessons that came with heartbreak, and she had used those lessons to build a life that was hers alone. She was no longer the woman who had cried herself to sleep every night, who had second-guessed her worth and her decisions. That version of Sarah had been buried under layers of self-doubt and insecurity. The woman standing in front of the mirror now was someone entirely different, a woman who had fought for herself, who had learned to love herself, and who had reclaimed her power. Sarah had started to believe, truly believe, that she was enough. Not because of anything Mark had done, or not done, but because she was worthy of love, respect, and happiness simply for being who she was. She had learned that her worth didn't depend on anyone else's opinion of her. She was enough, just as she was. The first time Sarah said those words to herself, I am enough, she had been sitting on her balcony, watching the sun set over the city. It had been a quiet moment, just her and the fading light, and it had felt like a declaration, a promise. That was when she realized how far she had come. That was when she truly understood that the journey of healing wasn't just about moving on from the past, it was about embracing the future with open arms, ready to take on whatever came next. The change didn't happen overnight. There were still moments of doubt, moments when she would think back to the life she had with Mark and wonder how things could have been different. But those moments were fleeting now, no longer lingering in her mind as they once had. Sarah had learned to focus on the present, to live in the now, and to embrace the opportunities that were right in front of her. She was no longer waiting for someone else to complete her. She had learned how to be whole on her own, and that feeling of independence and self-reliance was liberating. She had finally understood that she didn't need a man to validate her existence. She didn't need anyone to tell her she was worthy. She had always been worthy. One afternoon, as Sarah sat in a cafe with her new group of friends, she realized just how far she had come. The people around her didn't know the story of her heartbreak. They only knew the Sarah who was confident, kind, and full of life. They didn't know the struggles she had faced, the dark nights of the soul, or the painful journey she had taken to get here. But it didn't matter. She wasn't defined by her past anymore. She was defined by who she was now, and who she was becoming. A sense of peace settled over her as she laughed with her friends, feeling completely at ease. She had never imagined that she could feel this way again, light-hearted, joyful, and free. The emptiness that had once consumed her was now filled with something more powerful, empowerment. Sarah had started to pursue her dreams in ways she hadn't before. She had begun painting again, and this time, she wasn't just painting for herself, she was painting for the world. She had joined a local art exhibition, where her work had received praise and recognition. It wasn't about the accolades, though. It was about the fact that she had taken a step forward, that she was no longer afraid to share her art with others. She had also started a new career path, one that aligned with her passions. It wasn't an easy transition, but it was a rewarding one. She had always loved writing, but she had never allowed herself to pursue it seriously. Now, she was writing for a living, contributing articles, and working on her own personal projects. It was a dream come true, one she had set aside for too long in favor of trying to please someone else, but perhaps the most profound change was in how Sarah viewed relationships. She wasn't in a hurry to jump into another one. She wasn't looking for someone to complete her anymore. She knew now that the most important relationship she would ever have was with herself. Once she had fully embraced that truth, she knew that love would come when the time was right, if it came at all. But she wasn't waiting for it. She wasn't waiting for anyone or anything. She was living her life for herself, and that made all the difference. One evening, as Sarah reflected on how far she had come, she thought back to the woman she had been before Mark. That woman had been full of hope, but also full of uncertainty. She had been afraid to take risks, afraid to fully trust, afraid to believe in herself. The woman she was now was different. She was confident, self-assured, and unapologetically herself. She was someone who had learned that her worth wasn't tied to anyone's approval, that her happiness didn't depend on anyone else, and that was when Sarah realized that the end of her relationship with Mark had been the beginning of something far more beautiful. It had been the catalyst that had forced her to confront her own fears, her own doubts, and her own insecurities. It had been the push she needed to step into the life she was always meant to live. Sarah had rebuilt herself from the ground up. She had transformed her pain into power, her heartbreak into hope, and her struggles into strength. She was no longer the woman who had been shattered by betrayal. She was a woman who had embraced the messiness of life, who had learned to love herself, and who had created a life filled with possibilities. As she stood at the edge of this new chapter, Sarah knew that there would be challenges ahead. But she was ready. She was ready for whatever the future held because she knew one thing for certain: she could handle anything. She had proven that to herself, and with that, Sarah smiled, looking ahead with excitement and anticipation for what was to come. She was ready for her new beginning. In this final part, Sarah fully embraces her personal empowerment. She has rediscovered her passions, rebuilt her life, and stepped into a new version of herself, one that is confident, independent, and ready for whatever the future holds. She no longer depends on anyone to define her. She has learned to love and trust herself. This marks the end of Sarah's journey, a journey of healing, growth, and transformation. Her story is one of overcoming betrayal and embracing a future that is hers alone.